Dave Bing, former mayor of the city of Detroit and founder and chairman of the Bing Youth Institute. Bing Youth Institute is the parent company of at least one or two more mentoring organizations. The one that we're working on today is called Bingo, and it's a mentoring organization that really focuses on 7th, 8th, and 9th grade African American boys. One-on-one mentoring with an African American man, and we're in our second year. You know, as a young man, when I first came to Detroit, I was very blessed that I always had adult men giving me advice, helping me to grow and develop. And I know how important that is to our young men today. And unfortunately, a lot of our young men are growing up in some very difficult environments. In a lot of cases, they are led by their mothers or their grandmothers. They don't have a man in the home. And I felt it was important that if our city is going to change, it really has to start with some of our young men knowing that people care about them, want them to have successful lives, because too many of them are looked upon in a very negative manner. Everybody talks about the bad things that our young kids are doing, but we do have a lot of kids doing the right thing. So we really want to promote that. So once I left office, I knew this is something that I wanted to do. When I was drafted by Detroit back in 1966, it was a little scary because I had no family here. I didn't know anybody here. And as an East Coast guy, I thought for sure I was going to New York. I was a number 2 player drafted, and the unfortunate thing for me is that the number 1 player was Cazzie Russell from the University of Michigan right up the street in Ann Arbor, and everybody in Detroit wanted Cazzie. So when I came here, I had a little disadvantage because people hadn't seen me play. They didn't know much about me. So I had to prove myself as an athlete, as a basketball player. And that started my rookie year. And early on in my rookie year, things really started to go well for me. And I got good support from the fans, and I made a lot of friends. And it dawned on me way back then that this was the right place for me. God works in a lot of different kind of ways. Had I gone to New York, I'm not sure who I would be today or where I would be. But Detroit embraced me, and it's a love affair. You know, when I first came here, Detroit was just starting to go through its transition. We still had about 1.3, 1.4 million people in the city. The automotive industry was still very strong. Motown was very strong. And there were a lot of good neighborhoods in the city. And because I played all my career downtown at Cobo Arena, it was a melting pot. And even though we weren't a very competitive team at that time, you know, all of those Motown artists would be at a game. And so, you know, all of a sudden, not only were you an athlete playing this game, but you were rubbing shoulders with Motown elites. You know, I happened to grow up in Washington, D.C. with Marvin Gaye. And Marvin was already here as a star. So we hooked up early on, and then I was introduced to, you know, the Smokey Robinsons, the Temptations, the Four Tops, the Martha and the Vandellas. I mean, everybody who was big in Motown came to basketball games. So we all became friends, and it was nothing like it. I knew Paul Reiser very well. Yep, and I know his son. So, you know, that's one of the things about Detroit. It's a small, big city. And once you get involved with people here, there's just an automatic connection, and the dots come very close together. You know, I came here in that summer of 1966, so I finished that first season, won Rookie of the Year, and like I said, met a lot of good people. In preparation for the following season, that summer, unlike players today, we all lived in the city, as we didn't make enough money to have a home somewhere else. So we got along well, and we were practicing getting ready for training camp over at Considine Rec Center over on Woodward Avenue when the riots broke out. And the police came to Considine and told us we had to leave, that there was a disturbance and they didn't think we were safe in that area. We had no idea the magnitude of what was going on. But as days passed and all the reports on TV let us know the magnitude of what was going on, it was devastating. I lived on 7 Mile and Greenfield area, and I can remember the National Guard coming up Greenfield because the armory was over on 8 Mile. And I'm 23 years old at the time. I had 2 little kids, and you saw, the fires, you saw the shootings, you saw all of the theft and all of that. And it made you say, what is going on here? It was really tough to look at. People got hurt, people got killed, and the news was really devastating. During that turbulent time, once again, like athletes back then, we didn't make enough money, so you had to work a second job. And that summer, I was working at the National Bank of Detroit as a teller, and down on Greenfield and Puritan. And so I'd go to work every day like everybody else. But when I'd come home, you were concerned, you got a young family, you were concerned about what was going on, are they going to be safe? And as a young athlete, I was called on to go into the community to see what we could do about talking to people and calm people down and et cetera, et cetera. Back then, John Conyers was the guy, he and Art Johnson were the guy that was kind of leading that effort. And so they got guys like myself, they got Willie Horton, they got a couple of the line football players to kind of go down and talk to people and say, we don't need to do this, we're ruining our city, et cetera, et cetera. But people were angry. And even though they liked us and they respected us, they still wanted to do what they thought they had to do. But I think we helped, and I would tell you that the following year, in 1968, when the Tigers won the World Series, that really brought our city back together. So as tough as it was, sports and athletics helped to bring people back together. My career in Detroit was a great career for me. After winning Rookie of the Year my first year, my second year, I led the league in scoring. I was an All-Star, All-Pro. And for 9 years here in Detroit, I made the All-Star team 7 years. Our team started to get better. We were competitive. And there was this love affair between the players and the community because Cobo was like no other place other than maybe Madison Square Garden, where the fans were right up on top of you. And there was a relationship that was built between the players and the fans. And so I fell in love with that. All the way until the end of my career in Detroit, I had a great time. I got to know a lot of people. I had to work in the off season. Even though I started to make more money after my second or third year, I still thought it was important to create a second career for myself. And so I worked in the National Bank of Detroit for 7 years and enjoyed it, learned a lot, met a lot of people. Nothing like the people in Detroit, I can tell you that. Once my basketball career was over, I knew that I wanted to be a business person. I was an entrepreneur. And I wasn't ready for it, so I had to train for a couple of years. With the 7 years I worked in the bank, I got a really good education and met a lot of good people in banking and finance. But I wanted to run my own company. And so I trained for 2 years in a steel company because I didn't see any African Americans in that industry. and I felt that was a good opportunity for me. I trained for 2 years in a company in the city of Detroit, Paragon Steel, out on 8 Mile and Hoover. And after 2 years, I felt it's my time. I need to go out and do my own thing. And I started my first company, Bing Steel, in 1980 with 4 people, including myself. We were able to grow the company over 29 years from those 4 people to about 1,300 people. We grew our sales from about year 1, 2 million, to close to 300 million by the time I was done. We built 6 plants in the city of Detroit. 80% of my employees were African American and 70% were from the city of Detroit. At the end of my 29-year business career, I felt it was time for me to enjoy my life, and that didn't happen. We had a problem with city government and the Kilpatrick administration, and I didn't like what was going on. I knew Kwame. I supported him for both of his terms. I thought he was an unbelievable, talented young man, but he made bad decisions, and our city was going in the wrong direction. At that time, the business community and I were pretty close, and we started talking, and they felt that I was the right person at the right time to get into politics and try to help turn the city around. I never saw myself as a politician, and I never, even my 4.5 years as mayor, didn't think I was a politician. I was a guy that could come in with a business background, with a sports and athletic background, and try to help turn the city around, to bring some trust back into city government because of what was going on. And those were the toughest 4.5 years of my life here in Detroit, because it doesn't matter what decision that you make, you're going to have a whole bunch of people mad. And, it doesn't matter what you do. And, our city was, at that time, bankrupt without having filed for bankruptcy. We were $18 billion in debt, long-term liabilities in debt. And, on an annual basis, we were running anywhere from $1 million to a $2 million deficit on an annual basis. You couldn't, I don't care how good you were, how smart you were, how hard you worked, you couldn't make it work. And people were angry, people were frustrated, people were distrusting of government. But I think people trusted me because they knew I was there to try to help, not necessarily to line my pockets, because my first 2.5 years I went without a salary. I had to actually move into the city of Detroit. I had to pay, actually, to be mayor, because I had to get an apartment, I had to furnish the apartment, and I had to live there. It was 24/7, and there was no easy days. And everybody just fought, and I was from a background of sports where working together as a team is what success is all about. But we had everybody working against each other, whether it was city versus suburbs, whether it was black against white, whether it was rich against poor. And, everybody had their opinions. But there were some tough days there. But, it was I was an athlete, so I never thought about quitting. You got to do everything that you can do. And fortunately, I brought with me a lot of good people into the administration. There was an unbelievable turnover of personnel, because you get in there and the culture was, I can get away with this, I can get away with that, I don't have to do this, I don't have to do that. And I said, no, it doesn't work like that. You got to come to work, you got to be on time, you got to work, you're going to be held accountable, or you're not going to be here. And so I had a major turnover of personnel. But in a short period of time, people started to say, the guy's about business, he's about trying to do the right thing, let's see if we can coalesce and work with him. And things started to get better. But even up until the governor made the decision to bring in an emergency manager, we had put together a good team, and we had started some, I think, putting some good things in place to bring our city back. And I think as we look now today, 2.5 years later, a lot of the things, initiatives that we started are starting to take root and going in the right direction. As I went into the mayor's office, and you went out into the neighborhoods, into the community, and you saw the frustration, you saw the anger. It was really reminiscent of what happened back in 1967. And it only took one incident to get people incited and do the wrong thing. And what concerned me most was that I didn't want that to happen again, because our city never came back from the riots in '67. We burned, all of our neighborhoods down, a lot of them, I should say. A lot of the businesses were displaced. And, the population continued to leave. We went from about 1.3 million down to about 700,000 people. You couldn't generate the revenue to provide the services that were needed for the people or the businesses that were still in Detroit. And we got to a point where you couldn't borrow any more money. So, you had to figure out, I've only got so much coming in, and you had to prioritize how you were going to spend that money. And so, whether people like it or not, there were winners and losers. You couldn't satisfy everybody. And when you didn't, people let you know about it in no uncertain terms. Some of those community and meetings were some of the toughest things we had to deal with, because people held you personally accountable for what happened or what didn't happen. And so you had to constantly go out there and try to soothe people as best you could, to let them, without lying to them, to let them know where we were. Let me tell you the truth. And I think some people started to understand the crisis that we were in. And that was tough, but it was necessary. When I look back, when I first came here, 66, 67, 68, race relations were difficult. They were very raw. We had a police department at that time. They had a division called Stress. And that was in the mid to late 60s. And there were a lot of police brutality that was going on. And people didn't trust the police department. People didn't trust anybody in government. And when Coleman Young in '73 came in as our mayor, as a strong black man, the black population in Detroit was still pretty strong and really rallied around the mayor in a big way. And the mayor, I think people in Detroit, black or white, who were doing wrong things, he was against that. So he's saying, we're coming to get you, I don't care who you are. And I think our city and our area has always had racial problems. And I think we still do today. I'm not so naive to think that everybody loves everybody. But it's getting better. And I think it's a process that we have to keep working through. Because just like there are good white people, bad white people, good black people, bad black people, and you got to try to bring the good people together, and we deal with the other faction. And it's a small percentage, but they get all of the attention from our media in particular. When something goes bad, they blow things out of proportion. And we don't really give credit to a lot of the people that are doing the right thing. And I hope that starts to change, that we can challenge our media to do positive stories, not to just placate people, but to let people know there are a lot of good people doing a lot of the right things, and people need to know about that. Yeah. You know, I think the temperature of the city when I came into office was pretty high. Because once again, based on what had gone on in the Kilpatrick administration and what seemed to be, and what was starting to happen in the automotive industry and the housing industry, all of those things hit us at the same time. So people who traditionally had good jobs now are out of a job. People were getting moved out of their homes, the biggest investment that they had. We were having all kinds of problems with public education. So nothing seemed to be going right. And so it was an unbelievable challenge. But my goal was always to try to do what's right, to don't keep people in the dark. Tell people the truth. If you can't do something, tell them. Because they had decisions to make. And I didn't want to make promises that I couldn't keep. So the race relations worsened, in my opinion, because there were a lot of people, black nationalists, if you will, who thought Kwame got a bad deal. Personally, that's a long time to be in prison for what he did. Not saying that he did what was right. He was wrong, no doubt about that. But 28 years is a hell of a long time. And you had a lot of people angry about that because he was a popular young man. And there were a lot of people that were upset. And, I'm coming in after him. And I'm a different individual than he is. I mean, they even looked at me as, oh, this is a corporate guy. What the hell does he know? He's not a guy that grew up here. He's not part of us. So I had to deal with all of that. And I'm lucky I had so many good people in the administration with me, because I think we all knew what our challenges were, and we all knew what our vision was and what it took